Why did you leave the Herald?
Oh, I'd been there for 4 years, and I was up to my 5th boss in 4 years. And when I had to explain data journalism again, I was like, that's it.
Oh, you're not going to believe what my next question
I know,
is.
I know.
Like, I already know because I think I saw you speak at Auckland University, so I'm kind of an expert on data journalism myself. But for people who might not know, what is data journalism?
So everyone's kind of got their own definition. So I've got my own one, the way I practiced it. So the basic idea is rather than using people as a source of stories and contacts, you use original data sources. So, and you analyze them yourself as well, rather than going to an academic or going to a political party. You just do the analysis yourself. And in my case, I built interactive visualizations, which were slightly more objective than writing 400-word text and try and give the audience the whole data set.
And it makes kind of complex and quite loaded information more accessible to people. So
hopefully.
That's cool. Thanks for doing that. And where does it kind of sit within the context of a wider media world that so often thrives on sensationalist journalism? Like, I imagine it's quite a combative relationship.
It kind of depends. If you're publishing the crime data, then it just works fine. It kind of depends on your analysis, but there's always, within newsrooms, especially bigger newsrooms, there's always space to do this kind of stuff. So there's always a balance. It's much bigger overseas. I imagine at this point, the New York Times data and graphics teams is about 50 people. We have about 2.5 people doing this in the newsroom. So,
Yeah, well, I was just going to ask you how much more of a thing is data journalism now than when you first started doing it?
It is a thing.
It is a thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
For a start. There's some quite good people who are in the team now. Keating is going to be joining the team.
Yeah, he's the new you.
Yeah. And he wouldn't have joined 4 years ago, I imagine. So media's gotten better, or is trying to get it better at least, at using the data, just because there's more of it out there. And I hope things improve.
I remember when Keith first started doing data visualization, and it was quite a long time ago, and we were going to use some of his work on our TV show, and we didn't because it didn't look right, which is kind of one of the interesting things about data journalism, is that you kind of have to understand the art as well, don't you?
Yeah.
Was that hard for you?
It got easier as you practiced. I think it takes time. It takes interacting with the audience. On the Herald site, you get like 2 hours to be above the fold on the website, and if people click through and they leave after after 5 or 10 seconds and they don't understand, and you've just spent 2 months building something, then it doesn't work. And so one of the things that I learned was how to make things accessible to a wider audience and not just to the data geeks on Twitter. Yeah.
And you mentioned the 2.5 data journalists, and one of them is Lincoln Tan. So earlier this year, you and Lincoln were sort of propelled into the limelight, shall we say, by Winston Peters for the Herald's coverage of work visas and the top 5 source countries for work visas last year. He called it Herald Propaganda, written by 2 Asian immigrant reporters. How does it feel to have just like blatant facts, they're facts, right, challenged? Yeah. What is your response?
I wrote my response that day, but it was quite interesting because the data set is released by StatsNZ every month, and that's the data set they use to say immigration is at record levels, and it's the same data set. It's just that rather than publishing the press release from StatsNZ, I spent about a month analyzing it, and in the visualization, on the top, I mentioned that students translate to graduate visas later, but most of the people who come on work visas come from these countries. So I don't think it was going to be that much trouble. But obviously, it's election year, and that's not acceptable to actually publish detail like
Facts
that.
are only facts if white people present them.
Yeah.
We all know this.
Yeah.
And of course, another story you worked on, which became extremely controversial, you had to do the presentations for what we now know as the Chinese-sounding names story. It was Phil Twyford's, housing ownership project. Could you see that was problematic even as you're working on it?
So I didn't do the presentation. I kind of did the translating of the data for the newsroom. And I was in the first meeting where Phil Twyford and Rob Salmon brought the data to the Herald. And they said, we're not being racist, as they handed over the data set. But I kind of delayed the publication by a week because it didn't make a lot of sense. There was like a lot of complexity to it. And I contacted Thomas Lumley and Edward Ibrahim, who works in Wellington, who are like the best statisticians in the country. And I went back to my editors and I said, look, you should publish it, but you should say that Labour is saying this and the statisticians are saying that it's not true. And I didn't think the editors wanted to publish that. It was kind of like a really pivotal moment for me working in a New Zealand newsroom, because that's kind of when I realized that things don't have to be true to be published. And the story ran with the headline, "We have Chinese buyers." And all I did was add some bullet points which basically said this data is wrong, but they were published like on the 5th page inside in a little box, and no one really saw them. So yeah, it was hugely problematic. And I saw, as an immigrant and as a person of color, I saw a huge problem with it. But no one else in the newsroom saw any problem with it. When I went and approached senior journalist, I was told it's a great story. And so yeah, I think it's still not been addressed, and no one's really addressed how they went about doing it. And a huge issue of data literacy if you're just going to publish analysis done by political parties for their own goals, and you're going to give it headlines like that. Yeah.
I wonder if that also indicates the value of social media and blogs, because both Keith in your replacement and Saming, who we heard from before, wrote forthright and useful analyses of what was published. Well, you must have been glad to see those, because it was kind of saying something you couldn't say, wasn't it?
Yeah, I gave Keith the draft of the story. But yeah, Keith was someone who I actually had the conversation about the data set. So generally I would talk with people outside the newsroom with anything I published for feedback. And I was quite glad that that happened. But at the same time, the social media bubble and the Herald front page are two very different things. And from my perspective, the story accomplished what Labour wanted it to accomplish, which was scaremongering and stuff. Yeah.
Now, Auckland has quite lively Indian and Chinese media. The former I'm quite thankfully privy to, but they're not all that visible outside these communities. Do you think Auckland is still struggling to reflect its own diversity in our media?
I think it's the other way around. Media is struggling to reflect Auckland's diversity rather than Auckland struggling to reflect its diversity in media. Part of the reason is the only reason I got a job in a newsroom was because I was technically better than anyone else there. It wasn't like, anyone thought they were increasing diversity. It was just I knew computers better than most people did. And it's been interesting for years in the Herald newsroom. I worked quite closely with Lincoln, who's probably the most experienced immigrant journalist, Asian journalist in a newsroom.
Asian immigrant journalist.
Yeah.
The three bad things.
Yeah. But I think the wider problem is it's just not just having people who are immigrants or from other backgrounds. I don't know this, but I've been in 3 newsrooms, Waikato Times, Stuff, Dominion Post 1, and the Herald. I've never seen a person of color in a leadership role. And
Do you think there should be a diversity quota? What's your opinion on something like that?
No, I think people should be more aware of it. Like if you're a journalist and you're saying that we're reporting on the society and we're reflecting the society, then it's just like ethical and moral to actually reflect that. Like my example for this would be that when I was working on the Chinese sounding name story and I tried to raise the concerns, one of the journalists said to me, but you don't understand, those people don't integrate well like you have, you know? That's kind of reflects what, you know, the conversation is inside newsrooms.
Yeah.
So if you have editorial meetings where all the people sitting around the table are white, and if you're just like one Asian person, like I've been in those meetings,
Yeah,
you don't really want to voice like, you know, like you guys are all wrong on this. You don't understand this. So it's a huge issue, and it's really interesting how it evolves, because if you walk on Queen Street and you go back to the Herald newsroom, those are two entirely different worlds.